A millionaire makes a bet and marries an ugly, black homeless woman, convinced that money can change everything. But what he discovers on his wedding night will turn his life upside down forever. Write in the comments where you're watching us from, and don't forget to subscribe. The grand ballroom of Henry Stanton's mansion shimmered under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Every detail of the opulent setting reflected its owner's immense wealth, from the marble floors to the carefully selected art pieces adorning the walls. Guests in tailored suits and designer dresses clinked glasses of champagne, their laughter floating through the air like music. Henry, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his mid-30s with striking blue eyes and a confidence that bordered on arrogance, stood near the grand window overlooking the estate's vast gardens. The evening was a celebration of success, though success was a term Henry used to describe every aspect of his life. For him, wealth wasn't just a measure of prosperity, it was proof of superiority. His guests shared similar sentiments, a circle of like-minded elites who basked in their privilege and rarely concerned themselves with the world beyond their gated mansions. Among them was Gerald, Henry's closest friend and frequent sparring partner in matters of ego. Gerald was shorter and broader than Henry, with a perpetual smirk that hinted at his love of stirring trouble. He approached Henry with a glass of scotch in hand, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "You know, Henry," Gerald began, leaning casually against the window frame, "you always boast about how money can solve any problem, bend any will." "Because it can," Henry replied without hesitation, taking a measured sip of his drink. His tone was calm, but the edge of pride was unmistakable. "Then let's put that theory to the test," Gerald said, his smirk widening. "I've got a challenge for you." Henry raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. Gerald's challenges were often extravagant, bordering on absurd, but they had become a cornerstone of their friendship, a way to prove dominance over one another. "Go on," Henry said, gesturing for Gerald to continue. Gerald turned toward the window, gesturing dramatically to the street below. The estate was perched on a hill, offering a clear view of the city. Even from their lofty vantage point, they could make out the figures moving on the streets below. One figure, in particular, caught Gerald's attention. A lone woman sitting on the curb, her form barely illuminated by a flickering street lamp. "There," Gerald said, pointing, "that woman. I bet you can't turn her into a lady fit for this very ballroom." Henry squinted, following Gerald's gesture. The woman was barely more than a shadow, hunched over with a thin blanket draped over her shoulders. Even from a distance, her disheveled appearance and the way she clutched a battered tin can spoke volumes about her circumstances. "You're joking," Henry said, a trace of disbelief in his voice. "I'm deadly serious," Gerald replied, his tone challenging. "Marry her. Turn her into a proper lady. Show us all how far your money and influence can go." Henry turned back to his drink, considering the absurdity of the proposition. "Why on earth would I stoop to such theatrics?" "Because you believe money is omnipotent," Gerald said, his smirk turning into a grin. "And because I'll make it worth your while. $2 million says you can't do it." The room fell silent as several other guests, drawn by the exchange, turned their attention to the duo. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that came with high-stakes games played among the wealthy. Henry's gaze returned to the figure on the street. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed more details. The way her hair hung in tangled strands, the patches of discoloration on her face, and the way she shivered against the night's cold. There was something profoundly unsettling about her presence, not just because of her appearance, but because she was a stark reminder of a world Henry worked hard to ignore. "You think I can't do it?" Henry asked, his voice laced with quiet defiance. "I think even you have limits," Gerald said, his tone dripping with mockery. "And that's okay. Admitting defeat isn't the worst thing in the world." Henry set his glass down with a deliberate motion. His pride, a force stronger than logic, surged within him. The challenge was ridiculous, offensive even, but backing down was unthinkable. "You have a deal," Henry said. 3 months. She'll be unrecognizable. A lady, through and through." The room erupted into laughter and applause, though Henry barely registered it. His eyes remained fixed on the figure below, now barely visible as the street lamp's light flickered out. He wasn't sure what he saw in her. Perhaps a test, a project, or a distraction. Whatever it was, he had made his decision. "Shall we go meet your muse?" Gerald asked, already heading toward the staircase. Henry followed without hesitation, the weight of the challenge settling on his shoulders. The grandeur of the ballroom faded as he descended, replaced by the cool night air and the distant hum of the city. The woman was still there, sitting motionless as the world moved around her. As Henry and Gerald approached, she looked up, her eyes meeting Henry's. They were tired, guarded, and filled with a quiet strength that caught him off guard. For a moment, Henry faltered, unsure of how to begin. "You," he said finally, his voice more curt than he intended. "What's your name?" The woman hesitated, her voice rough from disuse. Lizzie," she said, barely audible. Henry took a deep breath. This was the beginning of a game he hadn't fully planned for, but there was no turning back now. "Well, Lizzie," he said, offering his hand, "how would you like to change your life?" Lizzie stared at him, her expression unreadable. Whatever decision she made, Henry knew one thing. This was going to be more than he'd bargained for. The courthouse was an unassuming building, starkly contrasting the opulence of Henry Stanton's life. Lizzie stood in the corner of the room, her hands clutching the edges of her tattered coat. The smell of antiseptic and stale air hung heavily in the air. Henry was seated nearby, his expression unreadable as he tapped impatiently on his phone. For him, this wasn't a day to celebrate, but a transaction to complete. Lizzie couldn't shake the surreal nature of the situation. Less than 24 hours ago, she'd been sitting on the cold pavement, hoping to collect enough spare change for a meal. Now she was being fitted into a cheap, off-white dress provided by one of Henry's assistants, her life about to change in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. "Sign here," Henry said, his voice clipped. He handed her a pen and pointed to the line on the marriage certificate. Lizzie hesitated, staring at the paper as though it might bite her. Her eyes flicked to Henry. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry glanced at her, his expression a mixture of impatience and detached amusement. "Because I can," he replied, "and because it benefits us both. You'll get food, shelter, and money. I get—" He paused, his lip curling slightly. "A project." She flinched at the word, but what choice did she have? Lizzie knew this wasn't about kindness or charity. It was about his pride, his ego. And yet, even knowing that, the promise of stability was too tempting to refuse. With trembling hands, she signed her name. Her fingers brushed against Henry's for a moment as he took the pen back, but he quickly withdrew, as if even that brief contact was too much. The judge officiating the ceremony was brisk and formal, going through the motions with no interest in the odd pair standing before him. Henry responded to the vows with a curt "I do," while Lizzie's response was barely audible. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Lizzie felt no joy, no relief, only a hollow resignation. Henry didn't so much as glance at her as they exited the courthouse. His car, a sleek black luxury sedan, waited at the curb. Lizzie hesitated, unsure if she should follow him. "Get in," Henry said sharply, opening the door for her. Lizzie slid into the car, clutching her coat tightly around her. The interior was as pristine and cold as Henry himself, with soft leather seats and an array of technology she couldn't begin to understand. She sat stiffly, her back straight, afraid to touch anything. Henry's driver, a stoic man in his 40s, didn't so much as glance at her. As the car began to move, Lizzie stared out the window, watching the city blur past. She didn't speak, and neither did Henry. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine. When they arrived at Henry's estate, Lizzie felt a wave of apprehension. The mansion loomed before her, its towering columns and manicured gardens radiating an unapproachable grandeur. She followed Henry up the steps, her worn shoes echoing against the polished marble. Inside, the house was even more intimidating. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and every surface gleamed. Lizzie felt painfully out of place, her presence a glaring contrast to the perfection surrounding her. "This way," Henry said, leading her down a long corridor. He stopped in front of a door and pushed it open, revealing a modest guest bedroom. It was still larger and more luxurious than anything Lizzie had ever known, but compared to the rest of the house, it was clear this room was meant to keep her out of sight. "You'll stay here," Henry said. "Meals will be brought to you. If you need anything, ask the staff. Just don't bother me." Lizzie nodded, clutching her coat tightly. Henry's tone made it clear that this arrangement wasn't about kindness. She was here on his terms, and she was expected to remember that. He lingered in the doorway for a moment, his gaze briefly sweeping over her. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or pity. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Get some rest," he said curtly before turning and walking away. Lizzie closed the door behind him, leaning against it as she exhaled shakily. She felt like an intruder in a world that wasn't meant for her. The bed, with its crisp white linens, looked too pristine to touch. She sat carefully on the edge, her hands resting in her lap. For a moment, she let herself hope. Maybe this was her chance to start over, to build a better life. But as she glanced around the room, its sterile perfection only reinforced her fears. She wasn't a guest here. She was a stranger, an outsider, a project. Downstairs, Henry poured himself a drink and stared out the window. His guests from the previous night had been delighted by his decision, laughing at the absurdity of it all. Gerald had toasted to his courage, though Henry knew the man's approval was laced with mockery. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his thoughts returning to the woman upstairs. There was something about her that unsettled him. She wasn't like the polished women who usually surrounded him. She was raw, unfiltered, and painfully real. He dismissed the thought, downing his drink in one gulp. This was just a challenge, he reminded himself, a game to win. Nothing more. But as he stood there, staring at his own reflection in the glass, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had just made a deal with far greater consequences than he anticipated. Lizzie awoke to the sound of soft knocks at her door. For a moment, disoriented, she forgot where she was. The luxurious surroundings were a far cry from the cold streets she had called home. As reality sank in, she sat up, unsure if she was ready to face whatever awaited her in this alien world. The door creaked open, and a young maid peeked inside. "Breakfast is ready, ma'am," she said quietly, her gaze flicking over Lizzie's rumpled form. Lizzie hesitated, nodding awkwardly. It had been years since anyone had addressed her with even a shred of politeness. Downstairs, the dining room was a cavernous space filled with light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. The table stretched so far that Lizzie wondered if it ever saw more than one or two people at a time. Henry sat at the far end, scanning something on his tablet. He barely glanced at her as she shuffled in, her footsteps tentative against the polished floors. "Sit," he said curtly, gesturing to the seat opposite him. Lizzie did as she was told, staring at the array of food that had been laid out. Freshly baked bread, perfectly sliced fruits, steaming eggs, and an assortment of pastries. It was more than she had seen in weeks, but she hesitated, her stomach twisting with discomfort rather than hunger. "Eat," Henry said without looking up. His tone made it clear it wasn't a suggestion. Lizzie reached for a piece of bread, her hands trembling slightly. She took a small bite, chewing slowly, as if she didn't trust her own appetite. The silence between them was thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional clink of Henry's fork against his plate. "You'll need new clothes," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the monotony. He set down his tablet and looked at her for the first time that morning. "Something that fits." Lizzie flinched slightly under his gaze. I'm fine with what I have," she said, her voice soft but firm. Henry raised an eyebrow, his expression one of mild incredulity. "You can't walk around looking like that." Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She glanced down at her threadbare dress, the fabric clean but hopelessly worn. It was all she had left from her life before the streets. "I'm not here to impress anyone," she muttered. "No, you're here because I need you to fit into my life," Henry snapped, his tone sharper now, "and that starts with not looking like you just walked out of a charity drive." The words stung more than Lizzie cared to admit, but she swallowed her pride. She couldn't afford to antagonize him, not when her survival depended on his whims. "I'll wear whatever you want," she said quietly, her hands tightening around her fork. "Just tell me what to do." Henry leaned back in his chair, studying her. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps, or a hint of pity. "Good. My assistant will take you shopping this afternoon." The rest of the meal passed in silence. Lizzie ate sparingly, too self-conscious to do more than pick at the food. Henry, on the other hand, seemed entirely unbothered by her presence, his attention returning to his tablet. After breakfast, Lizzie was left to her own devices. She wandered the mansion, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty hallways. Every room she entered seemed larger and more extravagant than the last. The walls were adorned with art she didn't recognize, and the furniture was so pristine it looked as if no one had ever used it. She eventually found herself in the kitchen, where the staff worked quietly, their movements precise and efficient. They barely acknowledged her, their expressions polite but distant. Lizzie felt like a ghost, moving through a world where she didn't belong. Her shopping trip that afternoon was another exercise in discomfort. Henry's assistant, a polished woman named Celeste, led her through high-end boutiques with a practiced efficiency. Lizzie stood awkwardly as salespeople fussed over her, taking measurements and offering suggestions. "You'll want to avoid anything too bold," Celeste said, her tone neutral but firm. "Something understated, elegant." Lizzie nodded mutely, letting them drape her in fabrics that felt foreign against her skin. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back at her was clean, polished, and unremarkable, exactly what Henry wanted. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Lizzie woke early, ate breakfast in silence with Henry, and spent the rest of the day trying to navigate her new surroundings. The staff remained polite but distant, their eyes betraying their curiosity about the strange new woman living in their employer's home. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Lizzie had her first real interaction with the staff. She had wandered into the pantry, looking for something to occupy herself, when she heard muffled sobs coming from the laundry room. She hesitated, then stepped closer, peeking through the door. A young maid sat on the floor, her face buried in her hands. Lizzie hesitated, unsure if she should intrude, but something about the girl's quiet despair resonated with her. "Are you okay?" Lizzie asked gently. The maid looked up, startled. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, and she quickly wiped her face. I'm fine," she stammered. "Sorry, ma'am, I didn't mean to—" "It's okay," Lizzie said, stepping into the room. "You don't have to explain." The maid sniffled, her eyes darting nervously to the doorway. "I shouldn't be crying on the job. If Mr. Stanton finds out—" "He won't hear it from me," Lizzie assured her. She hesitated, then added, "What's your name?" "Clara," the maid said softly. Lizzie nodded. "Well, Clara, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. I know what it's like to feel alone." The girl's expression softened, and for the first time Lizzie felt a flicker of connection in this house that seemed determined to isolate her. That evening, Henry caught sight of Lizzie walking through the gardens. She moved with a quiet grace that he hadn't noticed before, her head held high despite the awkwardness of her situation. He watched her from the window, his thoughts conflicted. She was nothing like the women he was used to, polished, poised, and eager to please. Lizzie didn't care about his approval, and that both irritated and intrigued him. For the first time, he began to wonder if there was more to her than he had assumed, but he quickly dismissed the thought. This was just a game, he reminded himself, a project, nothing more. The days turned into weeks, and the tentative, uneasy truce between Henry and Lizzie began to shift. Though their interactions remained limited and formal, something unspoken simmered beneath the surface. Henry observed Lizzie more closely, no longer dismissing her as merely a project, but as someone whose quiet resilience demanded recognition. Still, his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it, to her or to himself. Lizzie, in turn, adjusted to life in the mansion, though she remained an outsider. The staff grew used to her presence, but treated her with a mix of politeness and distance. Despite the luxury around her, she often felt as if she were living in a gilded cage. Yet she remained steadfast, determined not to let the walls of the mansion define her. It was on a particularly brisk morning that Henry made the decision to take her transformation to the next level. He entered the dining room with a purposeful stride, his sharp suit immaculate as always. Lizzie was already there, seated at the far end of the table, a simple cardigan draped over her shoulders. She looked up, her expression guarded as he approached. "We're starting your treatments today," he announced, setting a stack of papers on the table. Lizzie blinked, confused. "Treatments?" Henry gestured to the documents. "I've hired the best dermatologists, nutritionists, and trainers money can buy. They'll be working to restore your health and—" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes scanning her face. "Your appearance." Lizzie's stomach churned at his words. Though she had grown accustomed to his bluntness, this felt particularly personal. "And what if I don't want to change?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Henry raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly against the table. "Do you think you have a choice in this? You agreed to this arrangement." Transformation is part of the deal." Lizzie stared at him, her fingers curling into fists under the table. She wanted to argue, to push back against his arrogance, but the truth was undeniable. She had agreed to this. She had no leverage to refuse. Taking a deep breath, she nodded, though the resentment in her eyes was hard to miss. The first appointment was with a dermatologist, a sharp-eyed woman with a calm demeanor who examined Lizzie with clinical precision. Years of malnourishment and exposure to the elements had taken their toll on her skin, leaving it patchy and scarred. The doctor outlined a treatment plan that involved a combination of medical procedures, creams, and supplements. "This won't be a quick fix," the doctor warned, her tone professional. "But with time, we can achieve significant results." Next came sessions with a nutritionist who designed a diet plan tailored to help Lizzie regain her strength and vitality. The meals she was given were nothing like the ones served at the grand dining table. They were simple, balanced, and specifically crafted to repair the damage her body had endured over the years. Then there was the fitness trainer, a no-nonsense woman who pushed Lizzie through grueling exercises designed to rebuild her endurance and posture. Lizzie hated every second of it, her muscles aching in ways she hadn't thought possible, but she refused to complain. If nothing else, the physical strain gave her a focus, a purpose. Through it all, Henry remained a distant observer. He rarely spoke to her directly about the treatments, but he made it a point to check in with the professionals he had hired. Their updates were clinical, detached, and exactly what he wanted to hear. Lizzie was improving, slowly but undeniably. Weeks passed, and the changes became evident. Lizzie's skin began to clear, her complexion brightening with each passing day. Her body grew stronger, her movements more assured. Her hair, once tangled and lifeless, was now glossy and well-kept, thanks to the efforts of a team of stylists who visited regularly. The first time Lizzie saw herself in the mirror after the initial wave of treatments, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her reflection wasn't perfect, but it was a stark contrast to the broken image she had carried with her for so long. Henry, too, noticed the transformation. One evening, as Lizzie stood by the window in the library, flipping through a book she had borrowed from the shelves, he caught sight of her. The light from the setting sun cast a golden glow over her face, highlighting the changes in her features. For a moment, he hesitated in the doorway, an unfamiliar sensation tugging at him. She looked beautiful. But it wasn't just her appearance that struck him. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet strength in her posture, the way she seemed more at ease in her own skin. He quickly shook off the thought, reminding himself that this was all part of the plan. The project was progressing as expected. Nothing more. Still, Henry couldn't help but notice the growing respect she commanded from others. The staff, who had once been indifferent to her, now treated her with a quiet admiration. Even Celeste, his exacting assistant, commented on Lizzie's progress during a meeting. "She's adapting well," Celeste said, handing Henry a report. "Better than I anticipated." Henry nodded absently, his thoughts elsewhere. Adapting. The word echoed in his mind, stirring a faint unease. He couldn't deny that Lizzie was changing, but what he hadn't anticipated was how much her presence was beginning to affect him. The culmination of her transformation came during a dinner party Henry hosted for a group of investors. It was the first time Lizzie was to be introduced to his social circle since the beginning of her treatments. The tension in the house was palpable as the evening approached, the staff working tirelessly to ensure everything was perfect. Lizzie stood in her room, staring at the gown Celeste had chosen for her, a deep emerald green that contrasted beautifully with her now glowing skin. She hesitated, her fingers brushing against the fabric. It felt like armor, a shield against the judgment she knew awaited her downstairs. When she finally descended the grand staircase, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, their expressions ranging from shock to awe. She moved gracefully, her head held high, refusing to let their stares intimidate her. Henry watched her from across the room, a rare flicker of pride crossing his features. "She's remarkable," one of the guests murmured to Henry, not bothering to lower their voice. "Where did you find her?" Henry's jaw tightened. The question, though meant as a compliment, grated on him. "She's my wife," he replied curtly, his tone leaving no room for further comment. Throughout the evening, Lizzie held her own. She engaged in polite conversation, her wit and intelligence shining through. For the first time, Henry realized she wasn't just surviving in his world. She was thriving. Later that night, as they returned to their respective rooms, Henry stopped her in the hallway. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Lizzie turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't doing it for you," she replied simply before walking away. Henry watched her retreating figure, a strange mix of emotions swirling within him. For the first time, he began to wonder if this project was slipping beyond his control. The night of the investor gala became a turning point, not just for Lizzie, but for Henry as well. Whispers of her transformation spread quickly among his circle of acquaintances. The once laughable woman he had brought into his home was now the subject of intrigue and admiration. But with newfound attention came deeper scrutiny and old prejudices lurking beneath the surface of polite smiles. In the days following the gala, Lizzie noticed a change in how people interacted with her. Strangers who had once ignored her now seemed eager to engage, their compliments often veiled with curiosity. "Where did you come from?" they'd ask, their words laced with thinly disguised condescension. Lizzie, ever composed, answered them with grace, refusing to allow their judgment to rattle her. Henry, on the other hand, was struggling to reconcile the emotions he had buried deep within himself. Watching Lizzie navigate his world with such poise was a stark reminder of how wrong he had been about her. She was no longer the project he had envisioned, but something far more complex, someone he respected, even admired. The realization unsettled him. One evening, Henry received a visit from Gerald, his longtime friend, and the man who had instigated the entire ordeal. Gerald arrived unannounced, his smug demeanor intact as he stepped into Henry's study, a glass of whiskey already in hand. "Henry," Gerald drawled, his tone dripping with mockery, "I hear your little experiment is going well. Quite the Cinderella story, isn't it?" Henry's jaw tightened. He had expected this confrontation sooner or later, but Gerald's words still grated on his nerves. "If you're here to gloat, save it," Henry replied coolly, leaning back in his chair. "The terms of the challenge are clear. She's proven more than capable of adapting." Gerald chuckled, swirling his whiskey. "Oh, I'm not gloating. I'm impressed, truly. But tell me, Henry, do you ever wonder what happens when the clock strikes midnight? When this all comes crashing down?" Henry's eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you implying?" Gerald leaned closer, his smirk widening. "She's playing the part beautifully, I'll admit. But let's not pretend she belongs here. You've dressed her up, polished her edges, but she's still, you know." He let the words hang in the air, his meaning clear. Before Henry could respond, the door to the study opened, and Lizzie stepped inside. She froze for a moment, her eyes darting between the two men. Gerald's smirk faltered briefly before he recovered, his tone turning saccharine. "Ah, the lady of the hour," he said, rising to his feet. "You've made quite the impression, Mrs. Stanton." Lizzie's gaze was steady, unflinching. "I wasn't aware we had guests," she said softly, her voice carrying a calm strength. Gerald approached her, his posture casual, but his eyes sharp. "I was just catching up with Henry," he said, his tone light but laden with unspoken meaning. "You've certainly surprised us all." "Surprised you?" Lizzie echoed, tilting her head slightly. "How so?" Gerald hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "Well, you've adapted remarkably well, given the circumstances." Lizzie's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes were piercing. "Circumstances don't define a person. Character does." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment Gerald was visibly thrown. Henry, who had been watching silently, felt a surge of pride at Lizzie's composure. But that pride was quickly overshadowed by a flicker of shame. Shame for having once shared Gerald's narrow-minded views. Gerald's expression darkened, but he recovered quickly, offering a thin smile. "Touché," he said, tipping his glass to her. "It seems Henry has found himself a formidable partner." As soon as Gerald left, Lizzie turned to Henry. Her expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to her voice. "That man," she said, "he's not your friend." Henry sighed, rubbing his temples. "I've known him for years. He's difficult, but—" "Difficult?" Lizzie interrupted, her tone sharpening. "He doesn't respect you. He doesn't respect anyone. Why do you keep him in your life?" Henry looked at her, caught off guard by the intensity in her voice. He had no answer, at least not one he was willing to admit. Instead, he deflected. "It's complicated." Lizzie shook her head, disappointment flickering in her eyes. "No, it's not. You're just afraid to let go of people who don't deserve a place in your life." Her words hit harder than Henry cared to admit. He watched as she turned and left the room, her quiet strength once again leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew. The following weeks brought more events, more dinners, more chances for Lizzie to prove herself. She met every challenge with grace, her confidence growing with each passing day. But with that growth came tension. The more she succeeded, the more Henry's world seemed to reject her. At another gala, Lizzie found herself cornered by a group of women, their smiles sharp and insincere. "You've certainly come a long way," one of them said, her tone sweetly condescending. "Tell us, where did you grow up?" Lizzie's smile didn't waver. "Far from here," she replied evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. The woman's expression faltered, but she quickly recovered. "And what do you think of your husband's world? All this luxury, it must be overwhelming for someone like you." Lizzie's gaze was steady, unflinching. "It's a world built on perception," she said, "but true value comes from what you give back, not what you take." The women exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for her response. Henry, watching from across the room, felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Pride? Admiration? It didn't matter. What mattered was that Lizzie had once again proven herself in a way that left him humbled. But as the night wore on, Henry found himself reflecting on her words. His world, his wealth, his carefully curated life, what had it truly amounted to? And what would it mean if Lizzie were no longer a part of it? For the first time, Henry began to see the cracks in his carefully constructed reality. And, for the first time, he wondered if Lizzie wasn't the one being transformed. If it was, in fact, him. The mansion was quiet in the early morning, with only the faint chirping of birds breaking the stillness. Lizzie sat by the window in her room, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She gazed out at the sprawling gardens, lost in thought. The events of the past few weeks had left her emotionally drained, but also strangely resolute. She had endured the judgment of Henry's world, faced the scorn of his so-called friends, and yet, through it all, she had stood her ground. Downstairs, Henry paced the study, his mind consumed by a storm of conflicting emotions. Gerald's visit had stirred something within him, forcing him to confront truths he had long ignored. Lizzie's quiet strength, her refusal to bow to the condescension of others, had not only impressed him, but unsettled him. She was no longer the project he had arrogantly imagined her to be. She was far more than that, and he didn't know what to do with the realization. It was mid-morning when Henry decided to approach Lizzie. He found her in the library, seated at a small desk with a book open before her. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm but guarded. "May I?" Henry asked, gesturing to the chair across from her. Lizzie nodded, closing the book and setting it aside. "What is it?" Henry hesitated for a moment, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I wanted to talk about everything," he began, "about how this all started." Lizzie raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint, wry smile. "You mean the bet?" Henry winced at her bluntness but nodded. "Yes, the bet, and the way I've treated you since then." Lizzie leaned back in her chair, her hands resting in her lap. "Go on." Henry took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "I treated you like a pawn in a game, and I justified it by telling myself that it didn't matter, that you wouldn't care because you were gaining something out of it." "And now?" Lizzie asked, her gaze unwavering. "And now I see how wrong I was," Henry said, meeting her eyes. "You're not a pawn, you're not a project, you're remarkable. You've faced things I can't even begin to understand, and you've done it with a grace and strength that puts me to shame." Lizzie's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. "Why are you telling me this now, Henry?" "Because I need you to know that I'm not the same man I was when this started," Henry said, his tone earnest. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better." Lizzie studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for, Henry," she said quietly. "It's something you earn." "I know," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." For the first time, Lizzie saw vulnerability in his eyes, a crack in the armor of arrogance he had worn so confidently. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Henry began to show his commitment through actions rather than words. He became more involved in the charitable projects Lizzie had expressed interest in, using his wealth and influence to support initiatives aimed at helping the homeless and those suffering from chronic illnesses. Lizzie watched with cautious optimism, unsure if his efforts were genuine or simply another attempt to prove himself. One day, Henry approached Lizzie with a proposal. They were seated in the garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the manicured hedges and blooming flowers. "I've been thinking," Henry began, his tone thoughtful, "about what you said, that true value comes from what you give back." Lizzie tilted her head, curious. And I want to start a foundation," Henry said, "a place where we can provide resources for people like you, people who've been overlooked or written off by society." Lizzie's eyes widened in surprise. You want to do this? For real?" "For real," Henry said, his expression sincere. "And I want you to run it." Lizzie blinked, taken aback. "Me? Why me?" "Because no one understands what it's like better than you," Henry said. "You've lived it. You know what people need. And I trust you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lizzie searched his face for any hint of ulterior motives, but found none. For the first time, she saw a man who was genuinely trying to change, not for his own gain, but because he believed it was the right thing to do. "All right," Lizzie said finally, her voice steady, "but on one condition." "Name it," Henry said. "You have to be involved too," Lizzie said, "not just as a name on a plaque, but as someone who's willing to get his hands dirty." Henry smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "Deal." The months that followed were some of the busiest and most fulfilling of Lizzie's life. With Henry's support, she established the foundation, which they named the Emerald Hope Initiative, a nod to the green dress she had worn at her first gala. The foundation focused on providing housing, medical care, and job training for those in need, with a particular emphasis on helping marginalized communities. Henry threw himself into the work alongside her, attending meetings, visiting shelters, and speaking at events. The more time they spent together, the more Lizzie began to see the sincerity in his efforts. He was no longer the man who had bet on her life as a joke. He was someone she could believe in, someone she could trust. But trust was a fragile thing, and Lizzie knew it wouldn't come easily. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of the mansion overlooking the city lights, Henry turned to her. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" he asked, his voice quiet. Lizzie looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I think forgiveness is a journey, Henry, and we're just getting started." Henry nodded, accepting her words with a quiet determination. For the first time in his life, he was willing to wait. He was willing to earn what he had once taken for granted. As they stood together under the stars, the distance between them felt smaller than it had ever been, and for the first time, both of them dared to hope for what might come next. The foundation launch was set for a bright spring afternoon, a time when the gardens of Henry's mansion were in full bloom and the air carried the scent of jasmine and fresh-cut grass. The sprawling estate had been transformed into a venue for the event, complete with white tents, neatly arranged seating, and a stage set against the backdrop of the lush greenery. The name Emerald Hope Initiative was prominently displayed on a banner, a symbol of the journey Lizzie and Henry had taken together. Lizzie stood near one of the tents, her hands clasped in front of her as she watched the final preparations. She wore a simple yet elegant dress in emerald green, a color that had become synonymous with her transformation and the hope she now symbolized. Guests milled about, some familiar faces from Henry's circle, others newcomers who had heard of the Foundation's mission and wanted to support it. Henry approached her, his presence as commanding as ever, though there was a softness in his expression that hadn't been there months ago. "Nervous?" he asked, offering her a glass of water. "A little," Lizzie admitted, taking the glass. "This is bigger than I imagined." "It's important," Henry said, his tone firm, "and it's because of you that it's happening." Lizzie glanced at him, her lips curving into a small smile. "It's because of us," she corrected. Before Henry could respond, Celeste approached with a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Stanton, the press is ready for the pre-event interview. Mrs. Stanton, they've asked for you to join as well." Lizzie stiffened at the title. Despite the months that had passed, she still wasn't used to being referred to as Mrs. Stanton, but she nodded, her resolve steady. "Of course." The interview was held near the stage. A small group of journalists gathered with their cameras and microphones. Henry spoke first, his words polished and confident as he explained the vision behind Emerald Hope: to provide housing, medical care, and education to those in need, focusing particularly on marginalized communities. When it was Lizzie's turn to speak, the room seemed to hold its breath. She glanced at Henry briefly before turning to face the cameras. "This foundation isn't just about giving people a second chance," Lizzie began, her voice calm but firm. "It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, no matter their circumstances. I know what it feels like to be invisible, to be dismissed because of how you look or where you come from, and I know how much difference a little kindness and opportunity can make." Her words were met with murmurs of approval, the journalists scribbling notes as the cameras clicked. Henry watched her with a quiet pride, marveling at how far she had come, not because of him, but in spite of him. As the interview concluded, Lizzie stepped off the stage and was immediately approached by a young woman. She was in her early 20s, her clothes clean but worn, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and desperation. "Mrs. Stanton," the woman began hesitantly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to say thank you. What you said, it means a lot. I've been struggling to keep a roof over my head, and knowing there's a place like this, it gives me hope." Lizzie's heart clenched. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder. "That's exactly why we're here," she said softly. "You're not alone anymore." The woman nodded, tears brimming in her eyes, and Lizzie promised to personally ensure she received help through the foundation. As the woman walked away, Henry approached, his expression thoughtful. "You were incredible," he said, his voice low. "You've given this foundation something I never could." "And what's that?" Lizzie asked, genuinely curious. "Heart," Henry replied. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Lizzie threw herself into the work, visiting shelters, meeting with staff, and listening to the stories of those they were helping. Henry accompanied her, often standing back as she connected with people in a way that seemed effortless. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the center of attention, and he found that he didn't mind. One of their visits brought them to a women's shelter on the outskirts of the city. The shelter was small but welcoming, with brightly painted walls and a playroom filled with toys for the children. Lizzie sat with a group of women, listening as they shared their struggles and fears. One woman, a single mother named Diana, caught her attention. Diana had escaped an abusive relationship and was trying to rebuild her life while raising a toddler. Her story was raw and heartbreaking, but there was a quiet strength in her that reminded Lizzie of herself. After the visit, Lizzie turned to Henry as they walked back to the car. "We need to do more for places like this," she said, her tone determined. "They're doing so much with so little." Henry nodded. "Then, let's expand the foundation's reach. More funding, more resources." Lizzie smiled, grateful for his support. For all his flaws, Henry had proven himself to be a man of action, willing to back his words with meaningful change. As the foundation grew, so did Lizzie and Henry's relationship. The walls that had once separated them slowly crumbled, replaced by a bond built on trust and mutual respect. Lizzie still held her guard up, wary of fully letting Henry in, but she couldn't deny the progress they had made. One evening, as they sat on the terrace overlooking the gardens, Henry turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Do you think we'll ever get past what brought us here?" he asked quietly. Lizzie considered his question carefully before responding. "I think we already have," she said. "But building something real takes time. And I think we're finally learning how to do that." Henry nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." Lizzie smiled, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that their partnership, both in life and in their work, could truly last. And for the first time, Henry allowed himself to hope that the woman he had once underestimated might be the one to save him from himself. The first anniversary of the Emerald Hope Initiative was marked with a celebration at the very shelter where Lizzie had first felt the profound impact of her work. The once worn building had been renovated with funds from the foundation, its walls now painted in bright, welcoming colors. The sound of children laughing echoed through the hallways, mingling with the chatter of volunteers and staff. Lizzie stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. She wore a simple dress in a soft shade of ivory, her natural grace shining through. Her transformation, both external and internal, was complete, but what truly set her apart now was the sense of purpose that radiated from her. Henry arrived moments later, dressed sharply in a navy suit. He scanned the room, his eyes finding Lizzie instantly. A small smile tugged at his lips as he watched her speak with a group of volunteers. She looked radiant, not because of the clothes or the setting, but because she was fully in her element. As he approached, Lizzie turned to him, her eyes lighting up. "You made it," she said, a hint of warmth in her tone. "I wouldn't miss it," Henry replied. He gestured to the room around them. "This is incredible. You've done something truly remarkable here." "We've done it," Lizzie corrected. She glanced at the crowd, her expression softening. "But it's just the beginning. There's still so much work to do." The evening's program included a series of speeches from those who had been helped by the foundation. One by one, they shared their stories. Tales of hardship, resilience, and the hope they had found through the initiative. Among them was Diana, the single mother Lizzie had met months ago. She stood on the small stage, holding her young son's hand as she spoke. "When I came here, I had nothing," Diana began, her voice trembling slightly. "I was scared, lost, and unsure of how I'd ever make it. But this place, it gave me hope. It gave me a chance to start over, and now I'm standing here with my son, ready to face the future." The room erupted into applause, and Diana stepped down, tears streaming down her face. Lizzie approached her, pulling her into a warm embrace. "You're incredible," Lizzie whispered. "Never forget that." Henry watched from a distance, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar emotion. Pride, admiration, love, it was all tangled together, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly humbled. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin, Henry found Lizzie standing on the shelter's small balcony, looking out at the city lights. He joined her, leaning against the railing. "You've changed so much," he said, breaking the silence. Lizzie glanced at him, her lips curving into a small smile. "So have you." Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I didn't think I was capable of it," he admitted. "Of change. Of seeing beyond my own selfishness." "People are capable of more than they realize," Lizzie said softly. "Sometimes it just takes the right circumstances to show them." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling between them. Finally, Henry turned to her, his expression serious. "Lizzie," he began, his voice low, "I need to ask you something." Lizzie tilted her head, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Henry hesitated, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Lizzie's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a simple yet elegant ring. "I know this started in the worst possible way," Henry said, his voice trembling slightly, "but I've come to realize that you've changed everything for me. You've shown me what it means to care, to give, to be better, and I can't imagine my life without you." Lizzie stared at him, her eyes wide. "Henry, I'm not asking out of guilt or obligation," Henry continued. "I'm asking because I love you, truly, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Will you marry me? For real this time?" Tears welled in Lizzie's eyes, and for a moment she was too overwhelmed to speak. But as she looked into Henry's eyes, she saw the sincerity, the vulnerability, and the man he had become. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "Yes, I'll marry you." A smile broke across Henry's face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the city lights twinkled in the distance. The wedding was a quiet affair, attended only by close friends, foundation staff, and some of the people they had helped along the way. Lizzie walked down the aisle in a simple gown, her eyes never leaving Henry's. When they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. "I promise to stand by you," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion, "in every moment, through every challenge, and to always strive to be the man you deserve." "And I promise to love you," Lizzie replied, her voice trembling but strong, "for who you are and for who you've become. Together, we'll keep building something better." The applause was thunderous as they kissed, sealing their commitment not just to each other, but to the life they had built together. In the years that followed, the Emerald Hope Initiative expanded its reach, helping thousands of people rebuild their lives. Lizzie became a prominent advocate for social justice, using her platform to inspire others to look beyond appearances and embrace the humanity in everyone. Henry, once a man defined by his arrogance and wealth, found fulfillment in the work they did together. He was no longer just a millionaire. He was a man who had learned to love, to give, and to grow. One evening, as they sat in the garden of their home, watching their adopted children play among the flowers, Henry turned to Lizzie. "You've changed my life in ways I never thought possible," he said softly. Lizzie smiled, reaching for his hand. "And you've shown me that even the most unexpected beginnings can lead to something beautiful." Together, they watched the sun set, their hearts full of hope for the future they had built. Together. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more like it. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're ready for more inspiring stories, check out our other videos. You won't want to miss them.